Hi everyone who is here. Welcome to the November live event at Rouxbe for Essential Vegan Desserts. I'm Fran Costigan. If you don't know me, I'm the director of vegan pastry at the Rouxbe Online Culinary School. And I am just delighted. This is a high point of my month, doing these lives. I like interacting with the guests who come and sharing some new information. And today I'm excited to say that Patrick Britton, our boss of production and filming and everything, is here with us. And I'm going to call for some photos and videos. And I do want to point out to you, before I get started on this topic, healthier holiday desserts, that if you're new to the live events or just need a refresher, on the right side of the screen, you can ask a question. Just type in your question, and I'm going to get to as many questions as I can, if not all of them. I want to welcome guests, anybody who is new, repeat guests, certainly Rouxbe students and my Essential Vegan Desserts students. I'm going to be highlighting some work by graduates and students today to show examples of this work. If anyone here is in Essential Vegan Desserts, I want to remind you to join the private Facebook group if you haven't already done so. It's a great place to interact with your colleagues. It's a good place. Maybe you're looking for a new mixer or a blender. It's a great place to ask those kinds of questions, show some of the work that you're doing. For questions of a technical matter, write to support@rouxbe.com and someone from our great team will get back to you with the answer. And you can always write to me at fran@rouxbe.com. And that anyone who's here can write to me at fran@rouxbe.com and I will get back to you. Back to the students in Essential Vegan Desserts. Sometimes, when you're going to do an assignment, you may have a question. There is a forum with questions and answers, and you may find your answer is there already. If not, just send it in and I will answer your question. I do all of the grading for this course and it's just a pleasure. So I want to say, a few people said to me about the topic, healthier holiday desserts. Why didn't you call them healthy holiday desserts? And I will tell you, it's my opinion that desserts are supposed to taste like desserts. And that means brownies should taste like brownies and not brown bread. And if you've been with me before, you may have heard me tell the story that at my very first job as a pastry chef in New York City, I was working at a vegan restaurant in Hell's Kitchen. And I took probably all of the sugar, almost all of the sweetener out. Now, back 25 plus years ago, we didn't have the variety that I had today, but was using vegan ingredients. And I just thought I should get rid of all the sweetener. And my boss said, Costigan, you're making brownies, not brown bread. Put some of the sweetener in. Now, the fact is, he made a point. I understand we don't want to be disappointed when we are looking at a cake. We want it to taste like a cake, a muffin, or whatever, a cookie. But a lot of old-fashioned desserts or desserts from way back in the day really did have an excess of sweetener in them. So it is okay to cut back on some of the sweetener. Remember, however, that sweeteners, whether granulated or liquid, have other functions beside flavor. So I use the minimum amount of appropriate sweetener to that dish to make a nice dessert. And the same thing with fat, which is another biggie where people say, well, can I get rid of the fat? So I'm going to talk about that today. But there are some basics in my mind for preparing healthier holiday desserts. The desserts healthier and you, the maker, feeling healthier. You know, in the United States, Thanksgiving, this is November, Thanksgiving is coming up really soon, and typically it is a very large, very heavy meal. Um, I often, and desserts are expected, and there are typical desserts for that meal. Your family may have some differences. I mean, I always have to do pumpkin pie, which is not my favorite. You know, we have favorites. I like it, but I probably wouldn't make it, except my son, Michael, expects pumpkin pie. Um, some families like to have ice cream. My mother-in-law used to make an enormous spread for Thanksgiving, so much food. And then she had pies, but she also did an ice cream bar. I mean, with toppings and all kinds of things. For me, that's just too much. In the same way that after a satisfactory meal, I really like to have a lighter dessert. I prefer to have a piece of cake or a more substantial dessert all by itself. But Thanksgiving, some of the rules are different. I did prepare an event document that you can download, and I've given you the recipe for the vegan pumpkin pie that is my original pumpkin pie, but with some changes. And it is in the Essential Vegan Desserts course as well. I've also given you a recipe for spiced nuts that are so delicious. I would recommend that you double the amount you make and keep them in a jar and put the jar somewhere else so you don't eat them all before the holiday comes. And I've also included a recipe for making your own pumpkin pie spice. I don't mind spending money on ingredients. I personally, you know, this is all up to you as an individual. I personally choose organic with spices. I want them to be non-irradiated. And I have a variety, you know, a vast variety of spices and herbs in my house that are dry and in my pantry, kept tightly closed away from light. But I don't see the point of buying a jar of pumpkin pie spice when we really have most of us, or many of us have the spices to make that, and then you can adjust it to make it your own. So let's get to what I think are the basics, some basics for making healthier holiday desserts and keeping yourself healthier and less. There's no reason to be stressed. I mean, I just think making food should be enjoyable, and that holds for the holiday, whether it's just for you or a few people or a lot of people. Plan your menu and be prepared to swap menu items due to availability and cost. You're probably aware that today there are some supply chain issues, that costs of basic ingredients is really skyrocketing. And as Andrea Corby Fine, who is a part of the Rouxbe family and a friend of mine in Philadelphia, pointed out, there is something called shrinkflation, where some manufacturers are actually, you want to look at the cans or boxes of things that you have, because the amount of ingredient might have changed, and that can affect your final product. So I shop at my farmer's market. I shop in a few different stores looking for the best quality ingredients at the best price. Now, I will be prepared to swap. I'm vegan. I've been plant-based for close to 30 years now. I'm not worried about the price of turkeys or the scarcity of turkey, because I won't be eating one. And frankly, even way before I was plant-based, I always liked the sides better. So that is not a problem. In terms of swapping your menu items, I'm sure that you still want to give to your friends and families the things they expect. For example, I make fresh cranberry sauce and fresh cranberry relish, and I have a dessert I made today with a cranberry component. But my mother always had a can of cranberry sauce on the table. She opened both sides of the can, pushed the cranberry sauce out, cut it up, and put it on the table. And I found a can of organic cranberry sauce last year. And just because I was thinking about my mother, I bought it. So it's that kind of thing. At Rouxbe, mise en place is key, no matter the dish that you're making. And all that means is gather your ingredients to make sure you have everything you need before you get started and prep them as needed. Believe me, once you start doing this regularly, you'll never stop. And this applies to desserts as well as savory. I have nuts that may need to be soaked, cashews to make cashew cream, for example, or walnuts or pecans that I want to roast. I prefer to roast my nuts in the oven at a lower temperature than many people. I like to roast them at 225 degrees for a longer period of time, but I never leave the kitchen when I've got nuts, seeds, oats, other flakes roasting, because if you're in another part of your house and you smell it, it's probably too late. They go from really nice to burnt in a hot second. Think in terms of components and make a game plan. And I'm going to show you desserts that I made for Thanksgiving, for healthier holiday desserts that are components. So I was able to do things in stages, chill some of them in the refrigerator. Some have to be in order to set. Some are just convenient. Some things in the freezer. If you have an idea about a variation for a dessert that you haven't made before, and I'm going to assume that the dessert that you want to vary is one from a reliable source, not just somewhere out in the internet, make a small version of your idea and do that way. You're doing a test. Now, for example, I told you we're going to be showing, I'm going to be featuring pumpkin pie today that is made without eggs and dairy. I decided today to make a half recipe, and I'm going to show you all the notes I did. And I did something different with the pumpkin filling, actually. And then I decided, what the heck, I was see if I could bake off a small ramekin of the pumpkin filling. And it really looked great. It's got the little crack even that you sometimes get with pumpkin pie. I'm looking forward to having a bite of this or more. After the live, I've got some roasted cranberries on there and a little cranberry jelly that I made using agar. There's a whole unit in the course on using agar. So that's what I mean about doing a test. If I'm making ganache, I want to do truffles, for example, or the cream, I always take a little bit. It might just be a spoonful, put it in the refrigerator with a gel. That way, you know ahead of time that the set is correct. And if it isn't, you can change it. When you're testing recipes, you want to make one change at a time. That's for sure. So in terms of setting yourself up for success, you're going to do your mise en place, you're going to do all your prep. I have my granulated sweeteners ground and marked and labeled. I have my chocolate chopped, that sort of thing. Make sure that you allow enough time to preheat the oven. My goodness, my oven. So I have 2 oven thermometers in my regular stove and one in my Breville countertop oven, which I use all the time. I love it. And they ding to say that they're at temperature, and ovens are rarely at temperature. It takes a long time. So get to know your oven and adjust as necessary. Now we're talking about healthier desserts. If you're doing non-baked desserts, there is a chocolate tart in the course that is made with cocoa powder, which is unsweetened cocoa powder, or cacao, which is unroasted cocoa powder. Dates, nice and helpful, adds sweetness, adds fiber, and the recipe, the crust calls for coconut butter or coconut oil, and the filling has some coconut oil in there. Nothing wrong with it unless you are someone who doesn't want to use coconut oil or you're following a whole food plant-based no oil diet. What does that coconut butter, coconut oil do in this type of no bake dessert? It sets the filling. So you have to find another way to set the filling, but it's actually quite easy to do. Making smaller versions also means portion control and faster setting components. So I like to use that. I do use fruit purees. Now, I do use some fat in many of my desserts, and some are naturally fat-free. When I use a fruit puree, it might be date paste, which if you're in the Rouxbe, in Essential Vegan Desserts, you've probably made date paste or apricot paste. Any sort of dried fruit is extremely sweet, and rarely, if ever, do you have to add more sweetener to the recipe. I happen to love dried plums, which we used to call prunes, and my friend Chef Charnolin and I share that. We love using prunes. So oftentimes I will, in my mini, I have to think how to say this, in the course, there is a recipe for a thin brownie sheet, it happens to be gluten-free. It stays nice and flexible and fudgy, so in the freezer, so it makes a great base for ice cream desserts or baked Alaska. It's made with some prune paste. Sometimes I do half prune, half date. So these are things that you can remember. If you are a whole food plant-based, no oil person, and you are going to be pulling the fat from batter-based desserts, it is possible. There are probably some other changes that you might want to make. There will be textural differences, that's for sure. And in terms of healthier desserts, I think the idea is to make something with real ingredients, no junk, just enough fat if the dessert requires fat, just enough sweetener, and a wholesome sweetener. It could be, I did a whole live event last month. It was last month on granulated sweeteners. You can look for that in the library if you're interested in the in the live events library is what I mean, not our local library. And you can review that. But this holiday time with our cinnamon and nutmeg and ginger and clove sort of spices, the warming spices, then using whole cane sugar, which has all of the molasses intact, or coconut sugar are really great options. Making the smaller desserts, I don't feel like it takes me more time than necessarily making one big pie. I like it. And my holidays, well, certainly the last few years through the COVID years, I had just me the first year, and then was with a smaller group after that. But I think it's really pretty. But if you make a cake or a pie, put it on a smaller plate, garnish appropriately, put some sauces, some dots on the plate, fill out the plate with fruit, maybe some crumbs we eat with our eyes, and then you've got a really nice dessert that is healthier because it isn't, just by the fact that it isn't bigger. And I think it's really important to eat joyfully and with gratitude. That's super important. Now, some of the desserts that are naturally healthier, meaning they don't have sweetener added to them. They are made without flour, so they're naturally gluten-free. I happen not to be gluten-free, but I certainly know that for many people that is an issue. So I'm going to ask Patrick now to show some photographs of lightly gelled soup, which is an assignment in the course. This is a beautiful example of a dessert for Thanksgiving. It's a cranberry-based, lightly gelled with, the soups are lightly gelled with agar, and then I see some fresh cranberries there, and it is designed with some cashew cream. So that is a beautiful holiday dessert to do, unsweetened. This is really interesting. This is Stavros from Greece, and he did an orange gelled soup with fruits of the forest and chestnuts. Chestnuts are just wonderful for the holiday. You know, they're come into season, and they're a wonderful nutritious. This is a very nutritious meal, but it is gorgeous. I don't think anyone would feel upset eating this at all. And maybe you serve a little cookie with it. This last one is really interesting to me. It's a spiced apple cider soup. So if you don't want to make apple pie, you've got the flavors in the soup, and there is some crumble on top as a garnish. And it almost, you know, to me, it reads like a pie dessert or a cobbler without the sugar and the oil. These soups are made with a fruit base, whether it's a no sugar added fruit juice or a whole, you know, juice pureed, a whole fruit pureed with spices. You infuse the liquid with your choice of spices. I sometimes use herbs like rosemary and sage and thyme, actually, and then you strain it out, and then you use some agar, which is vegetable based. It's seaweed. It's a seaweed gelling agent, because we don't use bovine gelatin. This is a vegan course, and agar has been used for millennia. It is healthful. It is good for you. It has no flavor. It has no calories, but it's something that you need to work with. That comes in 3 different forms, and we go through that in the course. Now, I think what I'm going to do before we get to the pumpkin pie and the video is come over here on my computer and answer some questions. So, oh, thank you very much. Patrick put the link to the granulated sugar event. So, Mishan wants to know what to use for food coloring or sprinkles. Most are not vegan or full of chemicals. Well, that's true. Well, I have asked Patrick to put some links. I've got 2 links for you to vegan, natural sprinkles that I do use. And for food colors, I've been using Suncor. There are the links. Suncor, it's Supernatural Sprinkles is one, and Color Kitchen is another. And Color Kitchen also does colors. These colors, these natural colors, are not necessarily as vibrant as the ones with chemicals, but they work really nicely. I use Suncor foods, which are naturally, they're dried and ground and beautiful fruits and vegetables to color my food as well. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking. I know my grandchildren like sprinkles. Now, Jeanette says, I love pumpkin pie. Well, welcome to the club. What's the best substitute for oil and eggs in a recipe to make it bake up properly? Jeanette has used cashews and flax, which worked well, but she's wondering if I had any other suggestions. What about a no oil crust? All right, I'm going to divide that in half and remind you all that you actually have a recipe available to you in as the event document for my recipe for pumpkin pie. So let me show you what replaces the eggs in this pie. And this pie has gotten, I mean, this pie recipe's fed a lot of people, and I get very good feedback on it. You can buy some organic pumpkin. It comes either in a box like this, or, and this is larger than the cans, I think. You always want to see, this is 16 ounces, or a can, which is 15 ounces of the same thing. What I did to make the little pumpkin that I showed you, and I'm going to show you a filling too, was I had roasted some butternut squash and a sweet potato, and I used that instead. And because I did a test, what I did was I weighed my ingredients. I divided the recipe in half. I weighed my ingredients. It's much easier to divide something in half when you're using gram weight, and it worked well. So I'm just going to put, let's see, where is my, I have to put another air pod in. Is that what they're called, these things? Yeah, I think so. I have started to use a bit of baked sweet potato, roasted sweet potato in my pumpkin pies and my pumpkin desserts. I think the flavor is fabulous. Pumpkin meat is bland on its own, particularly the packaged kind. And so we want to really spice it up. And oftentimes I do a spiced pumpkin first, where I cook the spices into the pumpkin before I just add them in. It makes the pie a bit darker, but really tastes good. And here I'm getting another vegetable into the filling. I've got potato. Now I roast my potatoes or cook them however you cook them ahead, put them in the refrigerator to cool. And that's when I'm told, or we've read, that you've got some resistant starch at that point, but also I think the flavor really improves. I think one of these days I'm going to do a sweet potato pie with a purple potato. I think that will really be fun. So what replaces the eggs? Let's see, it's behind me. In this pie, it is silken tofu. Now the recipe calls for a full pie, it calls for 1 Tetra Pak. So these are shelf stable until you open them, of extra firm or firm, Morinu or Moringa is another brand that I know, tofu. It says 12.5 ounces, 349 grams. You open this up. I always wash the top first. You open it up and tip out the water, and that's in the recipe. And then I weighed it, and I had, how do I know? I wrote it on the box. So I'd remember to tell you I had 330 grams, not 349. It was very easy to divide it in half, but I didn't divide it quite in half because I wanted to fill. Yeah, I did divide it in half. It was the sweet potato and the pumpkin. I did differently. So you do not taste the tofu. You should not taste the tofu unless you're having a tofu scramble or something where you want to taste the tofu. So I like to puree it first with the spices. Again, you've got the recipe for it. But in terms of spices, I think this is really important to tell you. So I have a tray of spices here, the typical ones, and I have a couple of different kinds of cinnamon. Now, I know I did a newsletter on the different kinds of cinnamon, and I just couldn't find it. If anybody's interested in reading it, because it was really a deep dive into cinnamon, send an email to me, fran@rouxbe.com, and I'll get it for you. But this one, for example, is the most typical cinnamon. Here it's called cinnamon verum. It is mildest. It's the mildest one. You should do a sniff test. And the one that most people in the United States, anyway, I know that, use. This royal cinnamon, also Vietnamese cinnamon, much spicier, much spicier. And you can tell by sniffing it. I have also picked up something called pie spice from Penzeys, and let's see what is in it. I'm guessing, yep, 2 different kinds of cinnamon and vanilla and sugar. We don't need sweeteners in our spices. And this is, I've got some allspice here. This is Penzi cinnamon, and this happens to be a mix of China cinnamon, Vietnamese cinnamon, Korenji cinnamon, and Ceylon cinnamon. The verum is Ceylon cinnamon. So you want to take into consideration what kind of spice, what kind of cinnamon you're using. But I want to go back first to telling you about spices, and I suggested that you might want to make your own pumpkin pie mixture to keep in a jar, keep in your pantry, use 1-to-1 anytime a recipe calls for pumpkin pie spice. Well, you have to make it with fresh spices, and this is something that's just the truth. So you do need to, I always date my spices. I date everything, actually all my food stuff. And then I know they don't last forever. If you're just, you take a sniff before you're going to make something and it doesn't taste like anything, or it's very, very faint, you're going to just make dust to put in your food. It's not going to add any flavor. I love ginger in pumpkin pie spice. I like ginger, ground ginger in with cranberries too. I think it gives a nice kick. So same thing. I hope I don't sneeze. Delish. All right, but here's something that I want to warn you about. I just told you use fresh spices that have a lot of flavor. Too much of these spices really spoils things. It will take your pumpkin filling, for example, or your pumpkin butter from delicious and spiced and sweetened just right to bitter. And I first discovered this when I was teaching at the Natural Gourmet Institute in New York City. And I was teaching in the professional program, and I guess it was Pie Day. And I tasted a lot of good ones, and I tasted quite a number that were bitter. And when I spoke with the students and we went through what they did, they were like, more is more. And that's not true. More is not more. You can always add. You can take something out very easily. When I do the pumpkin pie filling, and I'm going to go get mine from the refrigerator now, I always taste it before the arrowroot starch, or maybe there's some agar in it before those things go in, because I don't want to taste the starch. So this is something that I made earlier today, and I have a note on here. So let's see what the note says. The note says, no, it says, let's see, I use a lot of tape. It says half recipe. Okay, so this was a half recipe, but already I made that little pumpkin pie and I made something else. And it says, talk about tasting before the arrowroot goes in, and too much spice is no good. All right, I leave notes for myself. When I'm baking, when I'm making food, I really want to pay attention, but notes are a good thing. So that's what I want to tell you. This is a really good place, I would say, for Patrick to please show us a photo of the pumpkin pie that I'm talking about. I'll get back to the pie crust in a moment. So that is an assignment in Essential Vegan Desserts. And you can see it looks like, to me, it certainly looks like a slice of pumpkin pie in a nice pie crust. The pastry dough that I chose to teach in this course is a liquid fat base. It's oil. It's a neutral flavored oil like sunflower or grapeseed, or if you want to use a more robust olive oil for certain fillings, you can do that. There is 50% whole wheat pastry flour and 50% AP. So we've got some whole grain in there as well. And that is the pie that's made with tofu, and it is naped with some orange ginger cream. I think that using ginger is really nice, especially after a heavy meal. I think it helps us with digestion. It certainly helps me. So that's something that I want you to be aware of. Now, if you are avoiding soy because you're truly allergic to it, I've been eating soy for close to 30 years now, whole forms of soy, organic. I eat tempeh, I eat non-GMO tofu, I like edamame. I do use some soy milk. Um, but I don't use, fake stuff or really highly processed soy. But if that's a problem for you, you can probably replace the eggs and dairy with a cashew and flax and things like that. Now, let's see. I think the question was also about an oil-free crust, and I'm going to go back to that later. It's really impossible to do a rolled crust, in my opinion, without using some kind of fat. It's just going to be like cardboard. But there are workarounds, and I will give you some of the workarounds. Patrick, would you like to please show the video for making the candied nuts that go on this pie? Thank you.
To make these simple yet delicious candied nuts, pour the maple syrup and molasses onto the nuts. Here we are using pecans, however a variety of other nuts would also work. Next, gently mix to combine the ingredients. Be sure to mix well to ensure the nuts are evenly coated. Next, pour the nuts onto a parchment-lined baking sheet, spreading them out so they bake evenly. Place the nuts into the oven and bake for approximately 10 minutes, or until they look like this. Lastly, sprinkle the nuts with the cane sugar and gently toss to coat the hot nuts with the sugar. Continue to bake for another 3 or 4 minutes or until the sugar has fully melted. These nuts can be eaten as is, or they can be used in a variety of both sweet and savory dishes.
Well, that's a nice looking pumpkin pie. So a couple of things about the candied nuts that I want to share with you. If you don't want to use pecans, use another nut. Walnuts are very nice. They're more bitter tasting. I happen to really like them. If you want to cut the amount of sweetener that's on those nuts, just don't do the last step. Leave off the sugar and roast them a little bit longer with the maple syrup. And in place of, I don't use much molasses actually, unless you use organic molasses, you're getting chemical soup because molasses is a product, it's really the end of sugar refining and all the chemicals from non-organic granulated sugar are in there. So I like date syrup, which is delicious. To me, it has a bit of a molasses taste. I also like sorghum syrup. Sorghum is a cereal grass, and you may have seen sorghum flour or sorghum the grain, and those are really nice. So that's an option. One year, now my son and his family live in Los Angeles, and I was out there for one Thanksgiving, and I remember Michael he loves to cook. And in fact, all the kids like to cook. But he had a big bowl of these, what looked like these candied nuts on the table before dinner. And I thought that was a little odd that it was before dinner, but I tasted one. I was like, hey, Michael, I would like this recipe. They're delicious. I don't care for spicy food. And some of you have heard me say that before, I'm sure. But I said, what's the recipe? And he said, it's your candied nuts, Mom. I just used a little bit of maple syrup, less. I didn't put the sugar on. And then he used some ancho chili powder, and they were wonderful. It was a wonderful savory dish. A lot of candied nuts, traditional recipes or more traditional recipes, or what I like to say, old-fashioned recipes, because I think our recipes for vegan desserts are really the tradition now. but they use egg white, they use lots of sugar and things to make those nuts, and it really isn't necessary. So where I can pull something out, I will. Now let's see. Nancy says, I'm not a big baker, but wondering about all the best options for ingredients, including gluten-free ones. Well, Nancy, the lightly gelled fruit soups with that we saw just a little while ago with fruit on them, seasonal fruit, can be just a wonderful option. They're really pretty to look at. They can be made ahead. Other gluten-free options are, to my mind, always Thanksgiving is no exception. It's a nice time to have a chocolate truffle after dinner. They are naturally gluten-free unless you make a cake truffle using cake crumbs from a cake with, flour. But I'm thinking about infusing the ganache with pumpkin pie type spices and rolling them in chopped pumpkin seeds, for example. That would be in keeping with the holiday. That would be a nice dessert. You can do layered parfaits like this. Now, let me tell you what I made here, but I'm just going to move this out of the way so I can make sure you can see it. So what this is, well, let me get this one first. What I have here is, and I mean, I would make one big batch and then just put my serving dishes of choice, and these are quite small but satisfying, on a platter and just ladle things in or pipe things in or pour things in. This is a cashew cream. This is a cranberry agar gel, and the top is the pumpkin pie filling that I showed you that's in your recipe, but I didn't put the arrowroot in. I divided it up and I mixed it with some of the cashew cream, and then I put some bit of roasted cranberry liquid on the top, and it's lovely. This one is a little bit more finished. So here I have cashew cream, pumpkin pie filling without the arrowroot, some roasted cranberries roasted in orange juice and maple syrup, and this little maple leaf made from an agar gel. Cranberries have a lot of natural pectin in the same way that blueberries do. So if you're making a gel, you're going to be using much less of that. This came right out of my freezer. These are cake crumbs. This happens to be an orange cake. Or if you're following the no fat, the whole food plant-based no oil diet, make yourself one of your baked goods. Take a piece off or make it specifically to make crumbs, crumble it up, put it on a baking sheet, and keep it in your freezer. And then you have crumb in the bottom. I didn't say, no, in the bottom of this one, I actually have crumb, and I have some crumb on the top. So to me, this is like pumpkin pie in a glass, really. Let me show you the roasted cranberries because they're really pretty. So when I'm making a cranberry dish, I use a skillet instead of a pot because there's more surface area, things aren't packed, and what you want to happen, the cranberries in this case, to start popping, will happen more quickly. I got this started in the skillet. I got the maple syrup and the orange juice and the orange zest really hot. And then I finished in the oven. We do roasted fruit assignment in the course, and so it is different. And this way, many of the cranberries stay whole. And then I've got this lovely, lovely syrup to do something with. I think I will do something with it. I think I'll pour it just spoon it onto here. And it's really nice. It's really nice. It doesn't have to be cranberry. Remember, we have this time of the year. I don't think anyone would say no to a beautiful poached pear or a baked apple with appropriate fillings. Patrick, do you have the picture of the poached pear? Perhaps we can show that now. Well, that was the pumpkin pie. There, look at that. That's an assignment from one of my super talented students. And that is, to me, that is a beautiful Thanksgiving dessert. That is a poached pear. She roasted some fruit, glazed the pear with it, and laid it onto a small piece of cake. And that is, to me, a very satisfying dessert. So again, to make your desserts healthier by and large, use wholesome ingredients, make your own mixes when you can, use cocoa powder that's unsweetened, use high percentage chocolate. The higher the percentage of chocolate, and if it's 72% or 75%, it's going to have less sugar than something that's 52%. Read labels all the time. For a number of years, I didn't like the idea of sneaking vegetables into cakes, for example. I'm crazy about the Esselstyn family. I love the work they did. Some of you know, many of you know that I made Rip Esselstyn's wedding cakes, but I'm probably not going to be making a kale cake. I like kale. I like kale salad. I like kale every which way. But if you can put some beet puree into a chocolate cake, you're not going to taste the beet. Beets are sweet. That's going to work, and it's going to add some nutrition. You want to use at least a portion of whole grain flours. So for most people's palates, I do 50% all-purpose flour, and I use organic flours, unbleached, 50% whole wheat pastry flour. Think about making a rice pudding for Thanksgiving dessert, maybe with wild rice. That would be just delicious. I like corn muffins for Thanksgiving, but I also make something called Indian pudding, which is a really, early American dessert. What was it? It's cornmeal that is baked in the oven for a couple of hours, actually, in milk. Well, I use a plant milk. When soy allergies are not an issue, I use soy milk because it has some really good protein in it. Otherwise, I use oat milk, which is also very, very nice when you're getting ready to make your corn muffins for Thanksgiving, or your polenta or your Indian pudding. Always make sure that your cornmeal is fresh. Cornmeal goes rancid quickly, so buy from a reliable source and sniff it. Oftentimes you can tell if it's rancid just by giving it the sniff test. Sometimes you can't, but your product will taste a little bit bitter. So that's really important. I'm lucky because here in Philadelphia, nearby, there's a wonderful, I get wonderful fresh cornmeal, and I like cornmeal. I just like it. Hi, Terry. How are you? So Terry says, love your small portion, great taste advice. It helps me to portion control and strive for really great tasting desserts. Well, I think that that's right. I think, and I'm glad that you appreciate it. So I think that serving a smaller portion, whether it's an individual dessert. I mean, this wasn't necessarily intentional as a dessert, but it will be now. This was to test the pie filling, just to see what would happen. But I think this is really cute. Or my Chef Char always said this when we first met, and I brought some truffles to Charlene, actually. She said, oh my gosh, they're small, because so many of the things on the market the truffles are the size of golf balls. 1-2 bites of something that's really delicious is going to be natural portion control and also be satisfying. When you make something that doesn't taste good, when people have an expectation of dessert and it doesn't taste like dessert, your body's just going to keep looking for it. And that's when you're going to maybe hit your pantry or some other place later. And that's not really what we want to do. We want to be satisfied. We want cake to taste like cake. I want chocolate cake to taste like chocolate cake, not someone tried to trick me when I changed my diet all those years ago with a carob cake. Nothing wrong with carob inherently, but it is not a chocolate cake. So there you go. Leslie says, I'm making a dessert for Thanksgiving this year. What are some of your favorites for this time of the year? Well, Leslie, again, I like pumpkin pie. I like sweet potato pie. I like the fruit gels. I like corn muffins. I like cake. I like a chocolate cake with everything. So there you go with that. And I happen to love baked apples, and I think they make a beautiful, beautiful presentation. You can make them in your air fryer. If you have an air fryer, you can bake them. You just pick an apple that you like, takes the skin off some of the top, core them, and then I stuff them with a variety of dried fruits because that's going to add some sweetness, a little bit of a syrup like maple syrup, and some of these spices, and serve it with a pan sauce or just a sauce. And I think that's great. This next link is really exciting. Anyone here who's on Instagram, go look up, or after the event, look up Mayo Bakes. That's at MAYO. So Maya is a graduate of Essential Vegan Desserts, and she has started her own company, her own cake company, dessert company. She's doing exquisite work. You can see that on her page. But she entered Bake from Scratch magazine, which is a big magazine, is having a contest. And she is probably the only vegan baker in that contest. And she has made it to the second round. So if you're inclined, grab this link and vote for Maya. Oh, here, look at that. I mentioned Charlene, Chef Char, my good friend. Chef Char knows everything about whole food, plant-based, no oil, and she is part of the Rouxbe team that grades many of your assignments. And her question is, can you make a good pie crust using chilled almond butter as the fat source? Well, Char, that's an interesting question. And, the operative here is good. You can't do a rolled crust that way. I haven't done it, so I shouldn't say that definitively, but I'm pretty positive. I've really been I've made a lot of pastry doughs over the years. What you can do is get away from the idea of a rolled crust and do a pressed crust. If you just take nuts and dates, for example, and oats. Oats are always good to add. I like to add oats to my dessert and buzz it in the food processor. It's going to make a paste, or use a nut butter if you want, and then press that into a pie plate and bake it. I would add a little bit of baking soda maybe, and then it's really terrific. So let me know how that goes, and we can meet next week and chat about it some more. Cheryl wants to know, how do you choose a coconut milk that will make a beautiful whipped topping? That is actually a very interesting question. I have some brands that I like. I use organic coconut milk. I have started to use one from Native Forest. I use a lot of their products. That's called Simple. It doesn't have any guar in it because my former student and now friend Laura Hollenbach, Artfully Plant-Based on Instagram, started telling me why many people cannot have these emulsifiers. So I thought it really doesn't need it. Here's the thing, Cheryl. Some of them just, no matter how long you take your can of coconut milk and put it in the refrigerator, some of them don't separate into coconut fat, coconut cream, which is supposed to happen, gets hard and you can whip it, and the water on the bottom. Some of them just don't, and I don't have an answer for it, and I don't know anyone who does. I did a very big event a number of years ago, a wedding, and because I knew this is a potential problem, and if something's going to be a potential problem, I want to make, I want to have a plan B. So I had probably a third as many cans as I needed. Sometimes they just don't separate. But Native Forest is a good brand, and just keep them in the coldest part of your refrigerator before you do that. So let's see, Cheryl has another part of her question. I read that brands and batches of agar powder vary in jelly consistencies. That's true. So agar is a natural food. It is sea-based and seaweed. It is seaweed. And it should be standardized depending on companies, but it isn't always. In terms of the flakes, I have found anecdotally, meaning by using it over the years, that if I use flakes, Eden brand makes the strongest gel. And in terms of the powders, they're all pretty much the same, but there is one called Super Agar, and that one really works well. So Cheryl, how you determine it is by doing a test. You make your gel, you put a little bit in the refrigerator for 5-10 minutes, and I mean just a little bit, and you look at it, and is it too firm? Add more liquid. Is it too soft for your intention? Then cool it down and add more agar, and then mark the agar you use so that you know. That's a great question. Thank you, Cheryl. Hi, Kathy. Making your amazing chocolate pudding into 2-bite tarts. What do you suggest I do to make the texture just slightly tighter? That's a great, oh, are you doing that for Thanksgiving, Kathy? Or you're doing it for something else? Anyway, that's a great idea. So chocolate pudding is super simple to make, and Kathy's going to make little mini tarts. I would say, Kathy, and I have done this, when I want to ice a cake with chocolate pudding, I add a little bit of agar powder to the mixture before the arrowroot, because once arrowroot comes to, whoa, let me take that back. You didn't hear me say that. If you did, wipe your mind. Chocolate pudding cannot be made with arrowroot starch. Cannot. It gets slimy. So it's made with cornstarch or tapioca starch, never arrowroot. Add a little bit of agar. That's what I do, and it will work great. So Cheryl wants to know, how long in advance can she soak nuts? If you keep them in the refrigerator, you can soak them for a couple of days. Sometimes I change the water out. I'll rinse them and add fresh water. But I'll tell you what I've started to do, Cheryl and everybody else. I'm feeling clever about this. I soak cashews, for example, because I want to make cashew cream. I soak them. I drain them. I put them in a container. I put a label on it that says soaked cashews, this many ounces and grams, and keep them in my freezer, and they're ready to go. Aruna wants to know, can you store extra baking ingredients, flour, sugar, chocolate in the freezer? Flour, definitely. I haven't put sugar in the freezer. You might be able, your containers have to be really, really airtight. Chocolate, never, 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 never. So if you're asking me this question because you're in a climate that's really hot, then just try to find a cool place. And Jorda wants to know how to make the baked apple. Well, I think I have a baked apple recipe. That's not something that I do by recipe. I sort of do it by feel, but I have a recipe for it on my website, which is francostigan.com. Just go there and search baked apple, and you'll get a starter recipe for that. So I would love to know what some of you are making for the holiday. Oh my gosh, it looks like it's time to stop already. But I want to wish everyone a very happy, joyful, stressless, compassionate holiday. Let's all take care of one another, be grateful for what we have, and I'm sending all my best wishes to everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I'll see you next month.